I'm Noelle Whitaker. The disappointment in a family of doctors and degrees. I left med school, joined the army, became just a combat medic no one mentioned at dinner. Even after I dragged wounded soldiers through gunfire, even after 27 hostages came home because of my intel, my name never made the family wall. Until the day the president placed a medal on my chest, leaned in and whispered, "You didn't just save a soldier, you saved my brother." That day they finally saw me. But I had already saved myself. I got the call just after sunrise, the kind that doesn't wait for coffee or courage. "Sergeant Whitaker," the voice said, sharp, official. "You are to report to the office of the Secretary of the Army." I stood in my small Arlington apartment, phone still in my hand, staring at the quiet morning light spilling through the window. I ran my fingers along the faint scar near my collarbone, felt the steady thump of my heart, and exhaled. Tomorrow, the White House. And as I tried to quiet my mind, it wandered to a place it always did when life demanded more of me than I thought I had to give. Back home. Boston. The Whitaker house. If you saw it, you'd think it was perfect. A pristine colonial with white columns and ivy along the walls, nestled behind a squeaky iron gate that my father never allowed to be fixed. Perfection was the family brand after all. Inside, it smelled like old books and polished wood. Every inch was claimed by portraits, plaques, framed diplomas, and crystal awards. All of them theirs. My father, Dr. Graham Whitaker, the respected dean of economics at Andover College, was a man who could command a room with a single nod. Every conversation felt like a lecture, every word crisp, intentional, always measured. My mother, Dr. Elaine Whitaker, was even sharper, a renowned neuroscientist with a dozen patents, keynote speaker at medical symposiums, and the name underlined on countless research grants. And Grant, my older brother, was the star that never fell out of orbit. Harvard Law top of his class, recruited by one of the biggest firms in D.C. before he even walked across the graduation stage. Grant was the future they pointed to whenever I stumbled. Then there was me, Noelle Whitaker. The quiet one. The athlete. The almost bright enough. The disappointment they rarely said out loud but always carried in their eyes. From the moment I could walk, my path was laid out like train tracks. I was never meant to step off of Ivy League medical school residency, white coat prestige, and polished dinners where you drop your credentials like confetti. I tried to be that person for them. My bedroom walls were covered with anatomy charts instead of band posters. My birthdays came with gifts like the human brain and introduction to neurobiology, while Grant got the latest tech or a trip with friends. My mother would glance over my grades, pointing out where Grant had scored higher at my age, while my father would lift an eyebrow if I brought home anything less than perfect. I tried. God, I tried. But it always felt like wearing shoes half a size too small. I loved running track, the wind on my face reminding me what freedom felt like. I loved swimming laps at dawn, that quiet moment before the world told me who to be. I wrote poetry in the margins of my biology textbooks when no one was looking, words I never dared to read aloud. Once in 9th grade, I whispered that maybe I wanted to be a paramedic instead of a surgeon. My mother's fork paused midair, her face freezing. "That's a technician's job, Noelle," she said softly, the disappointment hidden behind her calm. "Not for someone with your mind." My father didn't even look up from his laptop. Every dinner felt like a performance review. Every test was a chance to prove I wasn't a mistake. And every breath I took that didn't fit their blueprint felt like betrayal. So I pushed myself. SAT prep, summer science camps, volunteering at hospitals, shadowing doctors, studying until my eyes burned, trying to earn a place in a family where belonging felt conditional. But the truth was, I wasn't failing. I just wasn't them. When I didn't get early acceptance to Johns Hopkins, my father's only words were, "We'll try again next year." When I chose state college over reapplying to Ivy Leagues, my mother stopped talking to me for a week. At 19, I walked past a military recruiting table on campus, the American flag rippling in the breeze. I didn't think of rebellion. I thought of a purpose. Of service that mattered beyond the framed degrees on a wall. The recruiter, Sergeant Dana Ruiz, didn't promise me glory. She promised grit, skill, and the chance to serve something bigger than my parents' expectations. 2 weeks later, I signed the papers. I didn't have the courage to tell them in person. I sent an email. I've joined the army as a combat medic. My ship date will be confirmed after training. Silence. Then a week later, my father's reply, "We'll talk when you come to your senses." They didn't know me. Maybe they never did. And now years later, as I stood in my small apartment, orders in hand, uniform hanging in the closet, I felt the gravity of everything I had carried to get here. The scars no one saw, the choices no one asked about. The battles fought far from any lecture hall. I was being called to the White House. And for a brief moment, I wondered if my family would finally see me. Not the failure, not the quiet disappointment. Not the daughter who didn't fit, just me. Before I ever learned how to lace combat boots or start an IV in the dark, I had already met my first combat medic. He was my grandfather. Walter Whitaker never spoke about the war at family gatherings. At Thanksgiving, he would nod politely as my father discussed policy papers or listen as Grant bragged about debate tournaments. When the family asked him about his career, he'd talk about hospital boards, research initiatives, and the health administration programs he led. But that wasn't the real story. The real story came out on quiet afternoons when it was just us sitting on the back porch with iced tea and chipped glasses, cicadas buzzing in the Boston summer heat. "You know," he said once, "when I was 9, I wasn't always wearing a tie pushing papers." I looked up from the book in my lap, surprised. Grandpa Walter was always calm, steady, the one person who didn't correct my posture at the dinner table or sigh at my B+ in chemistry. "What did you used to do?" I asked. His eyes drifted across the lawn to the hydrangeas lining the fence. For a long time he was quiet. "I carried a bag, Noel," he said finally. "Not a gun. A medic's bag." He told me how he landed in France in 1944, younger than I was when I enlisted, terrified and determined all at once. He talked about mud, about torn uniforms, about screaming men clutching at him while shells fell around them. He talked about holding pressure on wounds with bare hands, about whispering to soldiers who wouldn't live to see another dawn, about crawling under gunfire to pull someone back to safety even when his own legs were shaking. I didn't understand the details back then, but I saw the look in his eyes. Not pride, not pain. Something deeper, like a quiet truth he carried alone in a family obsessed with medals of a different kind. Late one evening, when the porch was dark, except for the porch light above us, he came back with a small box wrapped in cloth. He placed it in my hands. "Open it," he said. Inside was a tarnished silver badge, a caduceus etched in the center. "My medic insignia," he said softly. This was who I was, Noel. Before the degrees, before the offices, before the titles. I held it carefully, feeling the weight of it press into my palms. "I saved lives not with research papers but with bandages in the mud," he continued. "Remember that. What you give people matters more than what you can prove to them." I nodded, too young to grasp the promise he was asking me to make. But I never forget. After that, Grandpa Walter and I shared a silent pact. During family dinners, when Grant announced another award or my parents discussed grants and tenure, I would glance across the table and Grandpa would give me the smallest nod. A reminder that there was more to life than checkmarks and titles. When I came home one day with a B on a physics test, my mother's lips pressed into a thin line. My father sighed, saying Grant never brought home grades like this. But later that night, Grandpa knocked softly on my door. He didn't say much. Just handed me a soda, sat beside me on the floor, and told me grades measure memory, not heart. He patted my shoulder. "Don't let them tell you who you are." I didn't tell my parents when I decided to enlist. But I tried to tell Grandpa. I called his number the day before I signed the papers, the words stuck in my throat, hoping he would pick up and tell me it was the right choice. But the call went to voicemail. I didn't know then that his health had been failing, that his lungs, damaged by a lifetime of quiet sacrifice, were giving out. A month later, while I was in week 5 of combat medic training, I got the call that he was gone. They held the funeral at a marble chapel filled with my parents' colleagues, hospital administrators, and professors. They spoke about his contributions to health policy and his leadership in administration. No one mentioned the mud, the battlefield, the badge he once held. After everyone had left, I walked to the casket alone. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the tarnished medic badge he had given me years before. I slipped it under his folded hands. "You didn't forget," I whispered. "And I won't either." They never asked me what I placed in that casket. They never noticed it was missing from my room. Maybe they didn't care. Or maybe they just didn't understand. But I carried him with me when I left for basic. Every time my arms burned from push-ups, every time I fought to stay awake in night drills, every time I wrapped a bandage around a training dummy while the sergeant screamed in my ear, I thought about Grandpa Walter. About how saving lives in the mud was more than enough. About how even if no one else saw it, I could. That badge had started a promise I intended to keep. And one day I would. I didn't plan to tell them that night. I had rehearsed the words for weeks, whispering them to myself as I walked across campus after classes I didn't care about anymore, saying them in the mirror when the dorm was quiet, mouthing them as I lay awake in the dark, wishing the courage would come. But courage doesn't arrive when you want it to. It comes when you're out of options. So when my mother insisted on a family dinner before finals, I knew it was time. The table was perfect, of course. Linen napkins, polished silver wine glasses that sparkled under the chandelier. My father poured a deep red Pinot into the crystal, swirling it like a ritual. My mother fussed over the lamb she had spent hours preparing. And Grant, my brother, sat at the head of the table, basking in the warmth of their pride, telling them about his law internship in DC and the professors who said he was destined for greatness. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, stomach twisting so hard I thought I might be sick. "So, Noelle," my mother said, finally looking at me. "How are your pre-med courses going?" I swallowed. I dropped organic chemistry. Silence. The kind that stretches forever and wraps around your throat. "You, what?" my father asked, his voice calm in that terrifying way he had. I dropped it, I repeated, my voice shaking, and I withdrew from school. The silence snapped like glass. "You withdrew?" My mother's voice rose, the word tasting sour in her mouth. "From the entire semester?" "No," I whispered, then louder, steadier, "from the university." My father's face tightened, the muscle in his jaw twitching as he set his wine glass down with a soft, deliberate click. Grant let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "What's the plan now, Noelle? Gonna go find yourself on a yoga retreat? Maybe write bad poetry in a coffee shop?" I clenched my hands tighter. "I enlisted." They stared at me, eyes wide, mouths open. "In the army," I said, forcing the words out. "I enlisted to become a combat medic." My mother's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling instantly. "Noelle, no. Why would you do something like this? After everything we've given you." My father's disappointment was louder than any scream. "You had a future, Noelle. You were going to be a doctor. You were going to make something of yourself." I felt the heat rising in my face, the tears threatening, but I swallowed them down. "I am going to make something of myself, just not the way you planned." Grant leaned back in his chair, arms folded, that smirk I had always hated playing at the corner of his mouth. "You think you're a hero now, running off to play soldier because you couldn't handle college." My hands were trembling, but I lifted my head and looked him dead in the eyes. "Grandpa Walter was a medic," I said quietly. "In the war. He saved lives." My father's eyes flashed. "Your grandfather was a hospital director after the war. That's what mattered. He came home and built something. Don't romanticize mud and blood as if that's a career." I could barely hear over the pounding in my ears. "He told me it mattered," I said, voice breaking despite my best efforts. "He told me saving lives matters even if it's not on a resume." My mother's tears spilled over. "We gave you everything, Noelle. Tutors, camps, opportunities. And this is how you repay us. By throwing your future away." "I'm not throwing it away," I whispered. "I'm choosing it." They didn't understand. They wouldn't understand. I reached into my bag and pulled out the paper I had carried for weeks, the enlistment confirmation. I placed it on the table between the crystal and the candles, a quiet declaration of war. "I leave in 2 weeks. Grant let out another laugh, but there was something sharp in it now. "Well, good luck playing soldier. Let us know when you get tired of it and want to come back to the real world." I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the hardwood. You don't get to laugh at this, I said, my voice steady now. Not anymore. My father looked away, picking up his wine glass again, dismissing me with the flick of his eyes. My mother sobbed quietly, dabbing her tears with a linen napkin, her shoulders shaking. No one stopped me as I turned and walked out of the dining room, down the polished hallway, past the pictures of Grant holding awards, past the plaques of my father's degrees, past the framed articles praising my mother's research. No pictures of me. No reminders of who I was or what I could be if I chose for myself. I walked out the front door into the cold night air that burned my lungs but made me feel alive. I didn't look back. I walked to the bus stop, clutching the enlistment papers to my chest, the stars above me clear for the first time in what felt like forever. That night I wasn't their disappointment. I wasn't their failed project. I was a soldier. Even if they didn't see it yet, basic training stripped me bare. Not just physically though, every muscle in my body burned for weeks. It stripped away everything I thought I was, everything my family told me I had to be, every fear that whispered I wasn't enough. I learned quickly that the Army didn't care about my last name or what university I almost attended. No one cared how many advanced classes I took or that my family thought I was a disappointment. They cared if I could keep up, if I could push past the pain, if I could work as a team when every inch of me screamed to quit. I almost did once. The first morning of PT, I couldn't catch my breath as we ran under a sky still dark, the air so cold it hurt my teeth. My legs ached, my lungs burned, and the drill sergeant's voice boomed. Move, Whitaker, or go home. I thought about home for a split second. The warm kitchen. The polished table. The look on my mother's face when she cried at the dinner table begging me not to leave. The disappointment in my father's eyes. Grant's laughter. And I kept running. Because going back wasn't an option anymore. I started to get stronger. My push-ups got cleaner. My run times dropped. My hands stopped shaking when I fired my weapon at the range, and I learned to disassemble and reassemble my rifle in the dark faster each time. But the biggest change was inside. I felt purpose, a clear line drawn in me that said, "This is who you are." Then came AIT, Advanced Individual Training, to become a combat medic. That was when I realized I had found what I was meant to do. They taught us to work under pressure to keep people alive in chaos. We learned to start fires while wearing chemical protective gear, to treat burns with limited supplies, to assess injuries in the dark while fake gunfire and smoke filled the air. I thrived in it. My hands, which once shook holding a pen, were steady when holding a scalpel. My mind, which once raced with anxiety during exams, was calm as I checked vitals on a screaming patient during a simulation. The chaos made sense to me in a way the silence of my childhood home never did. One instructor pulled me aside after a particularly brutal field training exercise. "You've got the hands of a surgeon, Whitaker," he said, "but more importantly, you've got the heart of a fighter." I held on to those words. Graduation day came faster than I expected. I stood on the parade field wearing my uniform, crisp and clean, boots polished so well I could see my reflection. My name was called near the top of my class. My ribbon bar was pinned to my chest, shining under the Texas sun. As I looked out at the crowd, I told myself not to search for them, not to hope. But I did for just a second. They weren't there, and that was okay. Because I was there. I flew home for my first leave with a pride in my spine I had never felt before. I didn't even mind the weight of my rucksack or the ache in my shoulders from carrying the gear that now felt like part of me. When I stepped off the bus wearing my uniform because I wanted to, my mother opened the door and froze. "Oh," she said, eyes dropping to the patches on my arm. "You didn't have time to change," I smiled. "I came straight from the station." She pressed her lips together and stepped aside. "Well, dinner's almost ready." Grant walked in from the kitchen, a glass of wine in his hand, his suit perfect as always. He looked me up and down, smirked, and said, "Nice costume." Halloween early this year. My jaw tightened, but I didn't respond. I helped set the table, moving around the kitchen like a stranger in a place I used to live. The house was the same: photos of Grant's graduation, his awards, my parents' achievements on every wall. I searched for a single reminder that I existed here, that I mattered. Nothing. At dinner, they spoke about Grant's job offers in DC, about a case he had won, about a new publication my mother was contributing to, about a lecture my father was preparing. No one asked about my training, about what I had learned, about how I had found something that felt like mine for the first time in my life. It was as if the uniform I wore made me invisible. That night in the guest room, I unpinned my ribbons and set them on the dresser. I touched the fabric of my uniform, remembering the dirt, the sweat, the moments when I thought I couldn't keep going and did. They would never see it. But I did. I lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet house, the familiar creaks and sighs in the walls, and I made myself a promise. They didn't have to see me for me to be real. I will keep moving forward. For the soldiers I would save. For the moments when fear met courage and I chose courage. For me, Afghanistan didn't look like war movies. It looked like dust, thick, heavy, clinging to skin, and settling into every crease of your uniform. It smelled like diesel sweat and the faint metallic edge of fear. And it felt endless. My first weeks there were quiet in a way that made me uneasy. Each day a cycle of routine patrol, supply runs, and checking gear, waiting for the moment everything would change. And it did. We were on a routine patrol, rolling down a dirt road surrounded by low hills and scattered scrub, nothing unusual in the briefing. The kind of day where you start to believe you'll get back to base without incident. I was in the second Humvee when the road exploded. The sound wasn't just loud, it was total. It swallowed everything, the heat and force slamming into us, rattling my teeth, stealing the air from my lungs. For a moment all I could hear was the high-pitched ring in my ears as the dust clouds swallowed us whole. Then came the screaming. Medic, my training kicked in before the fear could. I grabbed my bag, pushed the door open, and stumbled into the heat, heart pounding, vision clearing, as I forced each breath in and out. The first Humvee was in flames, thick black smoke curling into the sky. Small arms fire cracked in the distance, sharp and cold. I didn't care, I ran. 2 soldiers were dragging a third away from the wreckage, blood streaking down his leg in pulsing, terrifying bursts. Femoral artery. I dropped to my knees beside him, ignoring the gravel, cutting into my skin, pulling on gloves with shaking hands that steadied the moment they touched the wound. "Stay with me," I said, voice calm despite the chaos. "You're going to be okay." Tourniquet high and tight. Pressure. Gauze. Blood soaked through, instantly hot against my gloves. Rounds popped somewhere nearby, dirt kicking up around us. I didn't flinch. I felt my world narrow to the beat of his weakening pulse, to the way his eyes fluttered, to the grip of his hand on my wrist, holding on like I was the only thing keeping him tethered to this world. Because I was. Minutes felt like lifetimes. When the medevac finally came, I had stabilized him enough to keep him alive, pumping fluids, whispering to him, keeping him awake. The rotor wash whipped the dust into a frenzy as we loaded him onto the bird, and I stepped back, my gloves sticky, my body shaking with adrenaline. As the helicopter lifted off, I realized I was still kneeling in the dirt. I stood, legs weak, heart heavy, watching the bird disappear over the ridge. Back at base, I sat on my bunk, staring at my hands, the blood dried in the creases of my skin despite the gloves, the smell still in my nose. That night, I found out he survived. That my training, every second I spent in simulations and drills, had bought him time. That the tourniquet had saved his life. I didn't feel like a hero, I felt like a medic. And for the first time, that felt like enough. 2 days later, I was called into the CO's office. "Sit down, Whitaker," he said, looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. He handed me a paper. "You're being recommended for a commendation medal. With a V device. Valor." I stared at the words, numb, the memory of blood and dust still fresh, the sound of his gasps still echoing in my head. "Thank you, sir." I managed my voice small. He nodded once firmly. "You earned it." That night, I called home. I don't know what I expected. Maybe deep down I wanted to hear my mother's voice soften, or my father's approval for the first time in years. Maybe I wanted them to say they were proud. My mother answered. "Hi, Mom," I said, holding the phone tightly. "I just wanted to let you know. Something happened." Pause. "Are you okay?" she asked, sounding more annoyed than worried. "I'm fine. We were hit by an IED on patrol. I treated a soldier under fire. He survived because of what I did. I'm being awarded a medal for it." There was a silence long and heavy. Then her voice brightened in the way it did when she changed topics. "Well, that's nice, dear. Did you hear Grant just accepted a position at one of the top law firms in DC? We're so proud of him." I swallowed hard. "Yeah," I said quietly. "That's great." She started talking about Grant's new apartment, the bonus he was getting, how he was already being fast-tracked for big cases. I let her words wash over me, the phone pressed to my ear as I sat in a dark barracks room thousands of miles away. She didn't ask about the mission. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't ask what it felt like to hold someone's life in my hands. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time staring at the wall, the paper with the medal recommendation crumpled in my fist. And I realized that no matter what I did, it would never be enough for them. But it had been enough for him. And for me. And maybe for now that was enough. When the invitation arrived in my inbox, it didn't come with a phone call or a personal note. Just a crisp PDF attachment and a line from my mother: "Grant and Charlotte invite you to celebrate their engagement. Formal attire, dinner to follow." I read it 3 times sitting on the edge of my bunk, dusty boots still on the barracks, quiet around me. My leave had already been approved. I could go. But did I want to? I stared at the ceiling that night, thinking about the last time I had been home, the way my mother's eyes avoided the uniform I wore, the way Grant had smirked calling it a costume. The way my father's silence felt heavier than any reprimand. But a part of me, the part that still wanted to believe in family, packed my bag anyway. I wore my uniform on the flight home, not because I wanted to prove a point, but because it was all I had cleaned, and part of me was tired of hiding. When I arrived, my mother opened the door, her eyes flicking over the patches on my arm, the ribbons on my chest. "Oh," she said, managing a tight smile. "You didn't change." I shrugged. "It's been a long trip." "Well," she said, stepping aside, "go put your things down. We're going over last-minute details for the party." The house looked exactly the same as when I'd left it: polished wood floors, family portraits on every wall, shelves lined with Grant's awards, trophies, and certificates. I walked through the living room slowly, letting my eyes scan the photos. Grant in his cap and gown, shaking hands with important people, standing with my parents at banquets, smiling under spotlights. I searched for a single photo of me. There wasn't one. The night of the party, the house was filled with people in expensive clothes, holding glasses of wine, laughing politely at Grant's stories about the firm he would be joining in DC. I moved through the rooms like a ghost. Every conversation was about Grant and Charlotte, about his future cases, about the new apartment he was renting, about the view he would have from his office. No one asked where I'd flown in from, or how long I would be staying, or what I had been doing. At one point, one of my mother's friends, a woman in a string of pearls and perfume thick enough to taste, leaned in and said, "Oh, you're still in the army, dear." "Yes, ma'am," I said. She smiled like I had confirmed something amusing. "That's nice. It must be quite an adventure." I forced a polite smile. "Yes, ma'am." She turned away before I could say anything else. Inside, near the dining room, my mother had set up a display table, photos of Grant with Charlotte, Grant at law school, Grant receiving awards, newspaper clippings, acceptance letters, a framed article about him joining the firm. I stood there looking at it, all the candles flickering around the edges. My face wasn't there. My service. My deployments. The soldiers I had saved. The medal recommendation is still pending in my bag. None of it existed in this house. "Beautiful, isn't it?" I turned. Charlotte stood beside me, holding 2 glasses of sparkling water. "Thanks," I said, taking one. She nodded at the table. "Your mom really went all out." I looked back at the display, swallowing. "Yeah." Charlotte glanced at me, her brow furrowing slightly. "Is that a commendation medal on your uniform?" I blinked. "Yes." "For valor, right?" I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could, my mother's voice cut in from across the room. "Oh, that," she said, waving a hand as she joined us. "Just a training accident. Nothing serious. They give those out for all sorts of things these days." Charlotte frowned. "I thought the V device meant combat valor." My mother smiled tightly. "Oh, you know the military, always so dramatic." I felt the heat rising in my face, the room suddenly too small, too loud. I need some air, I said, setting the glass down. I walked out onto the porch, the cool night air hitting me like a slap grounding me. I stood there looking up at the stars, listening to the muffled laughter and clinking glasses inside, and I realized I didn't belong there. Not in that house. Not in those conversations. Not in their world. The next morning before the sun was up, I called the airline and booked an early flight. When my mother asked why I was leaving so soon, I told her I had work to get back to. She nodded, not looking me in the eye. I stepped outside, bag on my shoulder, uniform, still pressed the metal pin to my chest where it belonged. At the airport, I found a quiet corner and sat down, pulling out my phone. I stared at the blank screen, thumb hovering over my mother's number, wanting to call, wanting her to say she was proud, wanting her to see me. But I didn't call. Instead, I opened my notebook and wrote one sentence: I don't need their pictures to prove I exist. And as my flight was called, I stood up, squared my shoulders, and walked toward the gate. Because I had a life to get back to. And I didn't need to be in their photos to know who I was. They didn't call it a mission. They called it a support assignment, which was the Army's way of saying pack your bag, don't ask questions, and be ready for anything. I sat in the back of the briefing room, the lights harsh, the projector buzzing as satellite images flickered across the screen. Mountain ridges. A compound. Grainy figures. 3 American aid workers, 2 women, and a man had been taken hostage deep in the mountains. Intelligence said they would be moved within 72 hours, likely to be executed on camera if they weren't rescued. The operation was classified. Small team. Night insert. 0 margin for error. Sergeant Whitaker, the lieutenant colonel, said you'll be embedded with Alpha Team as the sole medical asset. You'll remain with the evac chopper until the team secures the hostages. Then you'll enter to provide immediate care. Questions? I shook my head, though inside my heart was pounding. We lifted off in darkness, 2 Black Hawks cutting through the moonless sky, the desert below silent, endless. I checked my gear again and again, the drone of the rotors vibrating through my bones. IV bags, tourniquets. Morphine. Blood expands. Trauma shears. My fingers brushed over the medic patch on my arm. I closed my eyes and exhaled, letting the thrum of the engine steady me. Captain Dane Calloway, team lead, caught my eye across the cabin and nodded once. We bring them home, he said. I nodded back. 20 minutes from the landing zone, everything went wrong. The first rocket struck the lead bird. The explosion lit the night, flames pouring from the engine as the helicopter spiraled down, disappearing behind a ridge in a plume of smoke. Our pilot swerved, hard alarms, blaring, the world tilting sideways. Hold on, someone yelled. We hit the ground so hard the impact knocked the breath out of me, my helmet slamming against the cabin wall. For a moment, all I could hear was ringing. Then reality snapped back. Smoke. Yelling. The crack of gunfire in the distance. I crawled toward the cockpit, glass crunching under my knees. The pilot was slumped over, blood seeping from a head wound. The co-pilot was conscious but pale, his leg twisted at an angle that made my stomach clench. Stay with me, I told them, pulling out my kit. Pressure bandage on the head wound. Neck brace. Splint for the leg. Morphine. I worked quickly, methodically, the way I had been trained, the chaos outside fading into a hum as I focused on what I could control. Contact left, someone shouted. Bullets kicked up dirt around us. I kept working. We dragged the pilots out, using the wreckage for cover. Smoke stung my eyes, but my hands didn't shake. Then Rivera went down. A shot to the thigh, arterial. I saw the bright red spray and heard his gasp. I was at his side before I realized I had moved, sliding on the dirt, pressing a hand over the wound as I pulled the tourniquet from my belt. You're okay, I told him, tightening it until the bleeding slowed. You're okay, Rivera. Rounds snapped overhead, ricocheting off metal. For hours we held that position, low on ammo, pinned down, waiting for evac that couldn't reach us. When Sergeant Halston took a round to the chest, I crawled to him, dirt in my mouth, hands moving without hesitation. His lung had collapsed. I performed a needle decompression with a penlight clenched between my teeth for visibility, praying it would buy him time. Whitaker, Captain Calloway yelled. We need coordinates for an airstrike. I crawled to the ridge, bullets zipping past me, the world narrowing to the sight of enemy positions below. I radioed in the coordinates, my voice steady, even as a round tore into the dirt inches from my elbow. Minutes later, the sky ripped open as 2 jets screamed overhead, dropping precision hell onto the enemy positions. The ground shook. Silence followed. But it wasn't over. By dawn, we were running out of supplies, out of time, out of strength. Then it happened. Tanner, 23, took a round to the abdomen. I dragged him behind cover, pressing hard on the wound as he gripped my vest. "Don't let me die," he whispered, tears in his eyes. "I won't," I promised, but deep down I knew. I worked for as long as I could, using everything in my kit, whispering to him, holding his hand until the grip went slack. He was gone. I closed his eyes, swallowing the scream in my throat. I didn't have time to mourn. Captain Calloway ordered us to move. We split into 2 teams. I led the wounded toward a secondary extraction point, dragging stretchers over rocks, blood staining the dust. For 48 hours, we evaded treated wounds, hid in caves when patrols passed, rationed morphine, and prayed. When the helicopter finally came, I helped load the wounded, collapsing into the seat, my legs screaming from shrapnel I hadn't noticed, my hands still sticky with blood. We lifted off as the sun rose, the desert below glowing gold. I didn't cry, I just closed my eyes and let the tears roll silently. Back at base, there were no cameras, no ceremony, just quiet. But what I didn't know then was the intel I had radioed during that hellish 48 hours led to a follow-up mission. 27 hostages were rescued because of what we saw, what we reported, what we survived. I hadn't just kept my team alive, I had given others a chance to live, and that, even without applause, was enough. They patched me up quickly. The shrapnel in my leg hadn't hit anything major, they said. Clean wound, straightforward recovery. "You're lucky," one medic told me as he stitched me up under bright fluorescent lights. I nodded, but inside I didn't feel lucky. Because while they could sew the skin, stop the bleeding, and give me pills for the pain no one could treat, what was happening inside my head? The nights were the worst. Even after I got back from the hospital to my bunk, I couldn't sleep. I would lie there in the dark, the ceiling above me blurry as I blinked, trying to push away the memories that came rushing back the moment I closed my eyes. The blast, the smoke. Tanner's hand gripping mine, the blood seeping through my gloves as I whispered, "You're okay," when I knew he wasn't. Sometimes I would wake up gasping for air, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would break through my ribs. No one saw those moments. No one saw me pressing the heels of my hands against my eyes, trying to erase the images of the canyon, the look in Tanner's eyes, the final breath. I tried to call home once. I don't even know why. Maybe I thought hearing my mother's voice would help, or that my father would say something that would remind me I was still me. My father answered. "Hello." His voice was distant, cautious. "Hi, Dad," I said, my voice sounding small in the quiet room. "You're out of the hospital?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Physically, I'm okay." He cleared his throat. "Well, maybe this is a sign, Noel, that it's time to think about what's next. Maybe it's time to consider something safer. Administration, perhaps." I closed my eyes, swallowing the words I wanted to say. "I'm not ready to stop," I said instead. He was silent for a moment. "Think about it." We hung up soon after, the empty dial tone echoing louder than any explosion. The next day, a text came from my mother. "If you're feeling better, can you help pick a photo for Grant's wedding announcement? The photographer sent too many." I stared at the screen, reading the message over and over, the images of that canyon playing in my mind on a loop. I didn't reply. That night, I sat on the floor beside my bunk, the lights off, the quiet pressing down on me. I pulled out the small black notebook I carried everywhere, the one I used for treatment notes, supply lists, and sometimes words I couldn't say out loud, and I started to write. Not a report. Not a casualty card. Not an after-action note. A letter. To me. Dear Noel. If you're reading this, it means you're still here. It means you've made it through something you didn't think you could. It means you're stronger than you know. They won't understand what you saw or what you carry, and that's okay. They don't have to. You saved lives. You did your job, you didn't run. You showed up when it mattered, even if no one was there to see it. And if no one else ever tells you this, know that you are enough. Even if they never understand, you do. You were there. And you made a difference. Don't forget that. N. When I finished, I closed the notebook and pressed it against my chest, letting the tears come quiet and steady. Not because I was weak, but because I was still here. A few days later, during a therapy session, a nurse suggested I speak with a chaplain or a counselor. I'm fine, I told her, forcing a smile. She looked at me, seeing right through it. Noelle, even the strongest soldiers need someone to help carry the weight sometimes. I didn't answer. Because, in my world, asking for help felt like admitting failure. So I kept it all inside, letting the silence and the sleepless nights become my normal. It wasn't until weeks later, when I was back on light duty helping in the recovery ward, that I started to see what healing could look like. Captain Rodriguez, who had lost both legs to an IED, rolled into the therapy room, eyes sharp. "You're Whitaker, right?" he asked, as I adjusted his wheelchair brakes. "That's me," I said. "I heard about what you did in Nightshade," he said, his voice low. "You kept your team alive. Even when it looked impossible." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. He smiled faintly. "You know, it's not the medals that matter," he said. "It's the fact that when everyone else ran from the fire, you ran toward it." His words stuck with me long after he rolled away. That night, I opened my notebook again and added one more line: "If no one else sees it, I will." And I meant it. Because even if the wounds inside me were invisible, they were real. But so was my strength. And for the first time, I let myself believe that was enough. They told me I was cleared for duty. My leg had healed well enough, the stitches long gone, leaving a pale scar I sometimes traced with my fingers during sleepless nights. The nightmares were quieter now, but they never fully disappeared. The Army wanted me back, but this time I chose how I would serve. I put in for a transfer to Walter Reed. Not to run from war, but to fight a different kind of battle. The war that came after. The first day I walked into the recovery ward, I smelled antiseptic and heard the low hum of machines, the occasional murmur of nurses moving between beds. But underneath it, I heard something else. The silence of men and women who had given pieces of themselves in places the world would never know. I saw it in the way they stared at the ceiling. In the way they gripped the edges of their beds during therapy, sweat rolling down their faces. In the way they flinched at sudden noises, their eyes darting toward doors, always assessing, always waiting. And I saw it in myself, reflected back in the sterile glass of hospital windows. I started as an assistant in physical therapy, helping patients learn to walk again, to use their new limbs, to adjust to wheelchairs and prosthetics. But it became clear that healing wasn't just about muscle and bone. It was about the mind. The invisible wounds. The weight we carried long after the bullets stopped. So I stayed late researching recovery models, studying trauma therapy methods, and rewriting training plans to combine physical therapy with trauma-informed care. I didn't ask permission. I just did it. Because I knew what it felt like to wake up gasping for air. I knew what it felt like to walk through the day with the memory of a final breath in your hands. And I knew that sometimes you needed someone to see you as more than your wounds. Colonel Patricia Wright, the head of the department, called me into her office one day. She tapped a folder on her desk, looking at me over her glasses. "Your program is working, Whitaker," she said. "Your patients' recovery rates are higher. They're engaging, showing up for therapy, asking for more sessions. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." I nodded, my heart steady, the same way it had been under fire. "Yes, ma'am." As I turned to leave, she added, "It takes a soldier to heal a soldier." I closed the door behind me, letting those words settle deep. One afternoon, I was helping a young Captain Rodriguez who had lost both legs to an IED. We had spent the morning working on balance drills, him learning to adjust to his new center of gravity. Sweat poured down his face as he pushed himself harder than any protocol required. "You good?" I asked. He looked up, breathing hard, but his eyes were sharp. "They tell me you're the medic from Nightshade." I froze, the air thick for a moment. "That's classified," I said quietly. "Not to the people you saved," he replied, a small, tired smile on his lips. I didn't know what to say, so I kept my hands busy adjusting the straps on his prosthetics. "You didn't just patch people up," he continued. "You kept them alive. You understand what it feels like to come back in pieces." I met his gaze. "You're not in pieces," I told him. "You're still here." He nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. So are you. That night, I sat at my desk in the small on-base apartment they gave me, my notebook open, pen tapping against the paper. I wrote, "You don't have to leave the battlefield to keep fighting. Healing is a battle too." And I'm still here. Weeks passed, then months. I developed a hybrid recovery program, one that combined strength training with mindfulness, group therapy with mobility exercises. I talked about fear and shame as easily as I talked about scar tissue and range of motion. Some soldiers resisted at first, uncomfortable with the vulnerability. But when they saw me leading the sessions in uniform with scars of my own, they listened. And slowly, they began to speak. About the dreams, about the guilt, about the moments they felt small, broken, invisible. And we worked through it one rep at a time, one breath at a time. Because healing wasn't about forgetting, it was about remembering and choosing to keep going anyway. Late one evening, as I packed up to leave, I found an envelope on my desk. No return address. Inside was a small card with a single sentence written in careful handwriting. "You saved me twice, once there, and now here." No name. But I didn't need one. I closed my eyes, holding the card against my chest, letting myself feel it, letting it sink in. Because medals are nice. Recognition is powerful. But knowing that you made a difference, that you helped someone choose to live even when it was hard, that is everything. I didn't tell my parents about the card. They still didn't understand what I did, what it meant, why I chose this life. But that was okay. Because I wasn't doing it for them anymore. I was doing it for the soldiers who trusted me to hold their pain, to guide them toward hope, to remind them they were more than what they lost. And I was doing it for the girl I once was, who needed to know she could matter in a world that didn't see her. And now I knew she did. The envelope looked like any other government letter. Thick paper, crisp edges, my name typed neatly across the front. But the moment I held it, I felt something shift in the air around me. I was sitting at my small desk in the Walter Reed office at the end of the day, the sun setting behind me, turning the windows gold. My heart started pounding before I even opened it. "You are requested to appear at the office of the Secretary of the Army." No details, just orders. I stared at the letter long after the light faded, the words blurring as questions raced through my mind. Was it about Nightshade? An investigation? A debrief I hadn't expected? Had I done something wrong? Or was it something else? That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the heater, my mind replaying every decision I had made during those 48 hours in the mountains. The airstrike call, the makeshift triage, the way I held Tanner's hand as he slipped away, the coordinates I radioed that led to the follow-up mission. 27 hostages were saved. 27 families who didn't have to get the call no family wants. I closed my eyes, whispering a prayer I wasn't even sure I believed in. Please let it be enough. The next morning, I stood in front of the Pentagon, the weight of my dress uniform heavy on my shoulders, boots polished, hair pinned back perfectly. I checked in, moving through security, each step echoing on the polished floors. A young aide led me down a quiet hallway, past closed doors, past people who barely glanced up as I passed. When we stopped in front of a heavy wooden door, he nodded once. "They're ready for you." Inside, a general I had seen only in official photos stood beside a man in a dark suit with a White House lapel pin. "Sergeant Whitaker," the general said, extending his hand. "Brigadier General Harris. This is Mr. Collins with the White House Military Office." I shook their hands, my palms sweating despite the cold in the room. "Please have a seat," Collins said. I sat, my spine straight, trying to hide the way my hands trembled slightly in my lap. General Harris opened a folder and looked at me, his eyes steady. "Sergeant, I'll get straight to the point. The President has reviewed your actions during Operation Nightshade and the intelligence you provided that led to the rescue of 27 hostages." I swallowed, trying to read the tone in his voice. "He believes," Harris continued, "that your actions exemplify the highest traditions of military service, and as such you are to be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross." The words didn't register at first. I blinked, the silence in the room pressing against my ears. I don't understand," I said softly. That's the second highest honor in the Army." Collins nodded. "And the President has requested to present it to you himself at the White House." My mind flashed to all the moments they didn't see, dragging wounded soldiers through dust and blood, calling in an airstrike while bullets cracked past my helmet, pressing a hand over a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding, whispering, "You're okay," when I wasn't sure they would be. I remembered the silence on the other end of the phone when I told my mother I was getting a commendation, only for her to change the subject to Grant's new job. I remembered the empty seat at graduation, the family photos I was never in. And now here I was being told the president wanted to thank me. Me. When I left the Pentagon, the air felt different. I stood outside, the winter wind biting at my face, the letter in my hand, the world moving around me as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Because for the first time I let myself feel it. Pride. Not for a medal, not for a ceremony, but for keeping people alive when it mattered most. For showing up when it would have been easier to walk away. For choosing this path even when no one understood why. I called Torres that night. "You're not gonna believe this," I said, my voice shaking with a laugh I hadn't felt in a long time. "What, you finally let yourself take a nap?" she teased. I grinned, wiping a tear from my cheek. "The president. He's giving me the Distinguished Service Cross. At the White House." The line went quiet for a moment. Then softly, "Damn, Noel. You deserve that." As I hung up, I looked at my reflection in the window. The same woman. The same scars. But for the first time I didn't see failure. I didn't see the black sheep of the Whitaker family. I saw a soldier. A medic. A survivor. And I promised myself as I stood there alone in that quiet room, no matter what happened next, I would walk into that ceremony with my head held high. Not for the cameras. Not for the medal. But for every life I touched. For every moment I chose courage. For me. The White House looked smaller in person. That was the first thought that hit me as I stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting my uniform, the Distinguished Service Cross pinned neatly against my chest. But as I walked up those steps, heart pounding in my ears, I realized it wasn't about the building. It was about what I was carrying inside me. I had spent years telling myself I didn't need recognition. That I didn't need anyone to see the quiet battles I fought, the lives I held in my hands, the moments I whispered to a soldier, "Stay with me," while bullets cracked overhead. But as I stood in the East Room, sunlight pouring through tall windows, surrounded by officers, soldiers, and dignitaries, I allowed myself to feel it. This moment mattered. They seated my family near the back. I saw them when I walked in, my father stiff in his suit, my mother clutching her purse, Grant checking his watch, looking out of place among the uniforms. They didn't wave. They didn't smile, they just watched. And for once I didn't shrink under their gaze. I stood tall. When they called my name, I stepped forward, boots silent on the polished floor, eyes fixed ahead as I approached the president. He looked me in the eye, nodded once, and turned to the room. "Today," he began, "we honor Sergeant Noel Whitaker for acts of extraordinary heroism, selflessness, and courage under fire." I heard the words, but it felt like I was floating, pieces of every moment replaying in my mind. Tanner's hand in mine. Calling in coordinates with dirt in my mouth. Dragging the wounded through the dust. Holding pressure on a wound while the world burned around me. Standing in the quiet after alone. Sergeant Whitaker, the president continued, kept her team alive against impossible odds. Her actions directly led to the rescue of 27 hostages who would not be here today if not for her bravery. He paused, turning back to me, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "My brother," he said softly, his eyes glinting, "was one of those hostages." I felt my breath catch. "He came home because of you." I swallowed hard, blinking back tears, the weight of the moment pressing into me. He raised the medal, securing it carefully, his hand resting briefly on my shoulder. "You didn't just save your team, Sergeant," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "You saved my family and dozens of others." He stepped back and saluted. I returned the salute, hand steady, heart thundering. Then the room erupted. Applause. Loud, rising, filling every corner of the room. It washed over me, a wave of sound that felt like warmth, like light, like the acknowledgement I never knew I needed until it was there. I saw generals stand clapping. Soldiers, medics, nurses, strangers, people who didn't know me but understood me. And in that sea of standing bodies, hands coming together, eyes shining, I saw them. My family. Still seated. frozen, watching. I met my father's eyes, and for the first time he looked away. My mother's lips trembled, her eyes glistening, her hands gripping her purse so hard her knuckles were white. Grant's mouth was slightly open, the smirk gone, replaced by something like realization. But I didn't look away. Because this was my moment. After the ceremony, people approached me, officers with tears in their eyes, parents who had lost children, young soldiers who whispered, "Thank you for what you did." One woman holding a small child pressed a hand over her heart. "My husband was one of the hostages you helped rescue," she said. "He's home because of you. Our daughter still has her father." I hugged her, tears finally slipping down my cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "No," I said softly, "thank you." In the corner of the reception, I saw my family hovering, unsure, out of place among the rows of uniforms. I walked over, my boots steady on the marble floor. They all turned as I approached. My father opened, his mouth closed, it then finally spoke. "I didn't know," he said quietly, his voice rough. "I didn't understand." My mother reached out her hand, brushing my sleeve. "We should have been there for you," she whispered, tears spilling. Grant looked at me, swallowing hard. "I'm proud of you, Noelle." I nodded, letting the silence hold everything they couldn't say. "It's okay," I said, my voice calm. "You don't have to understand." Because I did. And for the first time, that was enough. That night, as I lay in a hotel room, the city quiet outside, the medal resting on the bedside table, I closed my eyes and let myself feel it all. The fear, the grief, the strength, the pride, the truth. I didn't need a room full of applause to know my worth. I didn't need the president's words to tell me I mattered. But standing there in that moment, as the world finally saw me, I let myself be seen. Not as a disappointment, not as a failure, but as who I truly was. A soldier, a medic, a survivor. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe it fully. I was enough. After the White House, everything felt quieter. The world still moved fast, missions, training cycles, soldiers rotating in and out of Walter Reed, but inside me something had shifted. For the first time, I wasn't fighting to prove my worth. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe I had already done that. That weekend, I didn't go back to work immediately. Instead, I met up with Torres and a few others at a small bar near base. It was nothing fancy, dim lights, scratched tables, the smell of fries in the air, but it felt like home in a way the polished halls of the White House never could. When I walked in, they all stood and clapped, laughing, whistling, raising their glasses. To Sergeant Whitaker, Torres shouted, grinning, who got the president to stand at attention. I laughed, shaking my head, cheeks warm. Rodriguez, sitting at the corner, lifted his glass. To the medic who reminded us why we keep fighting. We toasted, letting the laughter wash away the heaviness for a while. And in that moment, I felt it, belonging. Not the forced kind where you shrink yourself to fit someone else's expectations, but the real kind where you are seen for exactly who you are, and it's enough. A week later, my father called. Not my mother, who usually sent texts or short, polite calls about holidays, but my father. "Can I come visit?" he asked. I paused, letting the silence stretch, letting myself decide. "Yeah," I said finally. "You can." He came to Walter Reed wearing civilian clothes, looking smaller than I remembered. I showed him around the facility, introduced him to some of the soldiers, and let him watch as I led a therapy session for a young private learning to walk again. He didn't say much, he just watched. Later, as we sat in the cafeteria, coffee cups between us, he cleared his throat. "I didn't understand," he said softly. "All those years I thought I was protecting you, guiding you towards something important." I stayed quiet, letting him speak. "But I see now," he continued, "that you were always meant for something I couldn't define." He looked up, eyes glistening. "I'm proud of you, Noelle." I nodded, swallowing hard. "Thank you," I whispered. It didn't erase the years of silence, of unspoken disappointment, of moments I had felt invisible. But it was a start. And that was enough. A few days later, a package arrived from my mother. Inside was a small velvet box and a folded note. I opened the box first. Inside was Grandpa Walter's medic badge, the one he had shown me when I was a child, the one he wore while saving lives in muddy fields far from home. The note was written in her neat, careful script. "He would have been so proud of you. We should have said it sooner." Love, Mom. I sat there on my bunk holding the badge in my hand, letting the tears come. Not out of pain, but out of release. Life settled into something real after that. I kept training medics, teaching them not just how to hold pressure on a wound, but how to hold space for a soldier's fear, how to look past the blood and see the human beneath. I kept working with wounded warriors, showing them that healing wasn't weakness, that standing up again could be the bravest thing they ever did. And I kept carrying Grandpa's badge in my pocket, a reminder that purpose often looks different than what the world expects. One day after a class on field trauma care, a young recruit stayed behind as the others filed out. She was small, quiet, with freckles across her nose and nervous hands that tugged at her sleeves. "Sergeant Whitaker," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I turned, smiling. "Yes." She took a deep breath. "I joined because of you. I saw the ceremony on television and heard what you did. And I thought, if she can do that, maybe I can too." I felt something in my chest loosen, warmth spreading through me. I stepped closer, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to be fearless," I told her. "You just have to keep showing up." She nodded, tears in her eyes. And I knew she would. That night, I sat on my bunk holding Grandpa's badge in one hand, the Distinguished Service Cross in the other. I looked at them both side by side. Different wars, same purpose. And I realized something. I didn't need the White House ceremony to define me. I didn't need the medal, the applause, the news stories, because I had already defined myself long before anyone else saw me. In the dust and blood. In the quiet moments after. In the choice to keep going when it would have been easier to stop. And as I lay down, letting the calm settle over me, I whispered into the darkness. That day, they finally saw me for who I was. But the truth is, I had already saved myself long before they ever looked. And I knew. This was just the beginning.